But welcome to all of you, especially warm welcome to those of you who don't call Grace Family Church your home. Perhaps being in a church for you is actually a little bit uncomfortable or maybe just unfamiliar, but we're so glad that you're here. And we want to acknowledge that all of us are here because in some way we're connected to this journey of depression. And my mom and I were actually talking about it just a few minutes ago, saying that it looks so different from person to person. And we want to acknowledge that there are many different stories in the room tonight. Those who are here to support someone, to learn, those of you who know that this is a journey you're on, and perhaps those of you who think this might be a reality of your life. Tonight, I hope that there will be some light bulb moments, some questions answered, but most importantly, I hope that for each and every single one of us, regardless of where we are on the journey of depression, that we will know we are not alone. And I think even just to look around the room right now, you can see you're not alone. 1 in 3 people are affected by depression at some point in their lives. And so I would just want to say thank you for coming out tonight, for acknowledging this reality and taking a step, whatever that is for you. Tonight is a step in the process of healing, supporting, and recovering together. So just to let you know how we're going to be doing things tonight, we've got James Sharrett with us. James has been a professional partner to Grace Family Church for many, many years. He provides oversight and support to our counseling department. And he's a clinical psychologist who has specialized in many different fields, from addictions, eating disorders, bipolar, trauma, relationships, and of course, depression is something that James has seen a lot of in his professional capacity. So James is going to be coming up here and speaking, and I think he's more comfortable in the counseling room than on a stage. So thank you, James, for going outside of your comfort zone. I said to him, I'd rather be speaking to 1,000 people than sitting in a counseling room hour after hour. So we appreciate that he's here tonight. And then Mark and Christine van Straten, who are the founders of Grace Family Church and have journeyed the depression story together as a couple, as a family. They're also my parents, which is obviously the most awesome reason that they're here. But they will be coming up and sharing some of their story, and James will be interviewing them, and then we'll move into a time of questions and answers. So if there is a question that pops into your mind during the course of our time together, write it down. We will give you space to do that, to ask any of our panelists that question later. But for now, please will you welcome James to the stage. We're so glad you're here, James.
Thank you, Jess. I must say, standing up here, I'm going to have more empathy for people like Mark and Skip and Wayne, who literally spend week after week preparing meaningful sermons that are going to be creative, meaningful, and which are going to communicate a message. And I think there are lots of us who sit in the congregation and who are very critical. From now on, I won't be one of those, Mark. My family moved to Durban in 2001. We'd moved from Underberg, where I worked. Tori, my wife, and I worked in Riverview Manor Rehab, where we worked a lot in the field of addiction. And one of our main priorities when we got to Durban was to find a church that we could slot into. We attended a number of churches in the area, and one of those was Trinity La Lucia, where Wayne and Michelle Taylor were preaching. I think the part that made us choose Trinity was we had Emma and Olivia, who were young, and Wayne, who loves children, gave us the most awesome hospitality greeting, and that was the done deal. Thanks, Wayne. In 2006, Wayne then got called to head up a church in Pretoria, and obviously for us, we'd been involved in the church for about 5 years. We loved it. We really enjoyed Wayne's style of preaching. So for us, it was a huge unsettling moment in terms of our spiritual journey, and we were very sad to see him go. And like anything in life, it's an adjustment. And you go through a period where you think, oh, God, why did you have to take Wayne away? We were so happy. What are we going to do now without him? Anyway, we stayed at Trinity for another 2 years. And then in 2008, we felt it was time to maybe make a change and to explore other options. Grace was one of the churches that we decided to attend. And I think it was on my second service that I attended at Grace, where part of the sermon was, I can't remember who it was, but someone was interviewing Christine van Straten in terms of some of her experiences and some of her journey with regard to depression. And I think in Matthew 7, verse 15, it says, beware of false prophets. And I think in terms of my Christian walk, as a psychologist, in certain services and maybe chatting to certain Christians, I'd often been left to feel like a false prophet. And so when I attended that service here at Grace, and Christine was talking so openly in front of a large congregation about depression and her experiences, it was incredibly comforting and a hugely refreshing experience for me. I sent Mark an email after the service, and I just said, for me personally, that was amazing. And I guess I've been here ever since. I just want to take the opportunity just to mention Mads Daisel, who I've worked with during the last few years. Mads has always met with us at the beginning of the year just to discuss which of us psychologists would still like to be involved in helping out with supervision. And Mads has always been, she's been so accommodating in terms of, James or whoever's there. Just tell us how you'd like to become involved, whether you want to become involved, how much you want to become involved. There was never any pressure. But I think the other thing about Mads is that God has always been at the center of all the work that she's done. And I've been inspired and hugely privileged to witness the incredible ministry that she played a huge role in developing and growing here at Grace. Mads is someone, I was always struck by her massive goals. She had big dreams, and she used to share some of those goals at the beginning of each year. And I can honestly say that I think Mads achieved a lot of those goals. So, Mads, a huge thank you to you. Mads has she's been blessed with a huge talent in training people. And one of the things that she's done so effectively here at Grace is trained hundreds of pastoral lay counselors who give up their time week in and week out to reach out to a community of people who need psychological counseling and assistance. So Mads is an incredible trainer, and Mads, I just lift you up in prayer. I know you're not here this evening, but on an awesome foundation that you've set here at Grace. And I also just want to thank Mark and his management team for providing the support that she needed to grow this incredible ministry. Lou, I just want to thank you, Lou Harmon. She's communicated with me so often. She's really efficient. I arrived here. She asked me how I was feeling. She gave me a glass of water. So, Lou, I don't know where you are, but thanks very much for all your support. As Jess said, there are a number of people in this congregation or this venue this evening who have completely different experiences and journeys and stories with regard to depression. And one of the things that I just want to comment on before I start is, there might be people who have suffered from depression. There might be people who are supporting people who are having difficulties with depression. There might be some of you who've lost people as a result of suicide. My heart really goes out to that group of people. But I think what I want to say is that not everything that I say this evening is necessarily going to be relevant to each of you. It's just such a wide variety of sort of categories that one has to touch on. But hopefully each of you will take something from what I have to say. I certainly wouldn't be able to do the work that I do without surrendering each day to God. God has blessed me with talents and skills to work with people, but I realize that God is in control and I am just a facilitator and mediator in that process. So while my spiritual beliefs are very important in terms of my life and my work, I'm not a pastor, so I'm going to talk more from a psychological perspective this evening. I'd also like to make mention that my practice is in Durban North, and so the sample of people that I work with is unique and different to therapists or psychologists who work in other areas. I say this from a sensitivity perspective because I think that psychotherapy, unfortunately, in South Africa is probably affordable to less than 10% of the population. I'm really praying and hoping that this changes one day, and Grace Family Church and the counseling ministry that they have here really taps into the enormous need that we face from a mental health perspective in the country and the world. But sensitive to the fact that if I was a therapist in Amaoti, which is 5 km west of Durban North, my experiences in terms of depression and what my frame of reference would be in that context would be significantly different to the one that I work with in Durban North. So while I might work with people who've been retrenched or gone through a divorce and are feeling depressed as a result, I'm very sensitive to the fact that if I was counseling in Amaoti, I'd be working with people who are depressed because they have no home, no food, and no hope, really. I also make mention of this because one of the things that I want to make a distinction between is what we call reactive depression versus a clinical or biological depression. A reactive depression is self-explanatory, where the person presents with exactly the same symptoms as someone with a clinical depression. However, the etiology is what differs between the two. So someone reacting with a reactive depression in Durban North, as I've indicated, would be very different to someone who's reacting to different circumstances in a place like Amaoti. So clinical depression, that is more biologically related, and an assessment is a very important part in making the distinction between these two. As I've said, the symptoms are the same. However, in your assessment, you're going to look very specifically at the genetic predisposition that might exist with someone who's got a clinical or biological depression. You're going to go back 3 generations and look at, is there a history of anyone in the family who's had a history of a mood disorder or any mental health difficulty, as well as suicide. And if there is a reasonably strong history in the family of depression, then you need to be keeping the option open that this person might have a clinical or a biological depression. Now, I can do 10 hours of psychotherapy with someone who has a clinical or biological depression. It's not going to have the same benefit as if I combine the person using counseling as well as medication. Because hours and hours of psychotherapy is not going to change the serotonin, dopamine, and noradrenaline levels in the brain. Reactive depression is going to respond more to an approach which might just involve psychotherapy, and medication is not necessarily necessary. Sadly, in today's world, where we're all incredibly busy and time is limited and finances are limited, while my practice is very busy and the need out there is huge, I think sometimes people choose the quicker option, a 15-minute consultation with a GP. It's going to cost me less. I don't have to go through the pain of hours and hours of psychotherapy, and I walk out with medication that will probably help just take the edge off things, lift my mood a bit, etc. So while medication is an essential part of the treatment process with regard to depression. I think that at times there are people out there who could get through some of what they're going through without medication. What is the difference between psychologists and psychiatrists? Psychiatrists are medical doctors. Our training is different. We go more of a psychology, social science route. We're not allowed to prescribe medication, and a GP is going to be able to treat most of your anxiety, depression, for children, the ADHD type of things. But I think when one starts looking at your bipolar mood disorders, your schizophrenias, etc., I certainly believe that a specialist psychiatrist would be worth considering in this regard. So what is depression? Depression, according to James, is someone who feels hopeless, helpless, and overwhelmed. They have a loss of interest and motivation. Solutions in life are just non-existent, and they feel stuck with the problem, and they often feel incredibly alone and lacking support. I guess another way of defining depression is to look at the very stressful lives that we live, and I think most of us function right at the top of our stress threshold, where we're balancing the demands of life, which will be work, deadlines, finances, spouse, children, with the resources. Those are your skills, your talents, your sleep, your energy, your exercise, and support. And I think when we're managing and we're coping in life, that balance is intact. But as we all know, life, one of the natural cycles of life that none of us are going to change, is the ups and downs. And sometimes we'll go through a season where we'll experience a season or a particularly stressful situation or life event which just pushes us into the red zone. That could be a retrenchment, it could be a divorce, it could be a loss of a loved one. And I think a lot of the people that I see, I think, 30 years ago, people referred to it as a nervous breakdown. And I think that's exactly what happens. This balance is broken by a life event that just sends someone into a phase where they feel completely overwhelmed. They might not be sleeping too well, and their functioning is just, not on the level it should be. I want to talk about suicide for a minute. I think it's a topic that most of us find particularly uncomfortable talking about. It's a little bit like cancer. When you go and visit someone, most of us want to make the person feel better, or at a funeral, and we don't know how to make them feel better, so sometimes we just avoid the issue. And I think this is a mistake, because suicidal thoughts is a very real part of what many people experience when they're in that deep, dark depression. And I believe that in counseling, validation is probably one of the key factors that anyone should consider in trying to support or help someone. If someone comes to see me and they say, James, I'm feeling depressed, I'm not sleeping, I'm overwhelmed, I'm fragile. If my response is something to the effect of, but you have a job, you live in Mhlanga, you have 3 beautiful kids, there's absolutely no validation. And the person will just feel like he doesn't get it. Whereas if I accept that what they're telling me is real and true, they're going to feel validated. I think the other thing is that a lot of people pass comments that are sometimes prejudiced or judgmental of people who've attempted suicide, had suicidal thoughts, or even someone who has successfully attempted suicide. And I think, that's where grace, in terms of the name of this church, is so comforting, because I think it's each of our responsibilities to demonstrate grace to people who, if you've got a bipolar mood disorder, where depressive episodes are a very real part of the condition, you know that you've got that condition for life if it's accurately diagnosed. So when you're going through a depressive episode and you know, even if you're compliant with regard to your medication and your therapy or your support group, that you will probably experience another one in the future, I believe some people get to a point where they say, I don't want that anymore. So I think in terms of the stressful lives that I mentioned, all of us are at risk of a reactive depression, in my opinion. It can happen to any of us because we're all under enormous stress and pressure on a day-to-day basis, and it's possible for each of us to be impacted by one of those massive life events which might just push us over the edge. So Matthew, you ready? Here come my recommendations. Just a few recommendations and just a few thoughts in terms of, some of what I think might be useful. The first point is, I think it's really important for all of us to acknowledge that depression is a very real, serious, and debilitating condition. We need to accept that and reach out to people who have those experiences. On that note, I'd also like to say that I really do believe that depression is a treatable condition. 30 years ago, I think people with a bipolar mood disorder were institutionalized, put on medication which gave them horrendous side effects, which basically incapacitated them and made it impossible for them to be able to function and work. This is certainly not the case anymore. The pharmacological advances, like oncology in the last 30 years, have been profound. The third point that I'd like to make is that I believe in life we are way too problem-focused. As a psychologist, we taught how to make a diagnosis, but as a therapist, I really try and move away from a diagnosis. I think it's focusing on the problem. I like to focus more on the solution. And I really believe that in terms of life is really about how do we cope with the problems that we face and how effective are we in terms of identifying solutions that might take us out of feeling stuck. People arrive in my office. James, my husband, is definitely a narcissist. James, my wife, is definitely bipolar. It's focusing very much on the problem. The fourth one is consider closing the door on suicide. It's not for me to prescribe or instruct anyone to do that. That's why I say it's a consideration. But I think in life, if we take example, the person who's running a Comrades Marathon, if they say to themselves before they start, if at the 70K mark I really feel tired or I'm, just over it, I'll stop. Well, I think the door's left open and there's a strong chance that when they do feel exactly that at the 80, 70K mark, they will opt out. Or for the addict, for example, if the addict says, I've been sober for a year now, it's New Year's Eve, I'm sure a glass of champagne won't hurt anyone to toast the new year in. Again, we're leaving the door open. And I think the moment we leave a door open, it's difficult to progress. We are going to feel like we don't want to live anymore, we don't want to face this anymore. And if we leave that door open, we're more inclined to use it. The other thing that I'd like to say is, and within context as well, especially with the reactive depression, some of the symptoms that one experiences feel completely overwhelming and intense at the time, and it's difficult to ever believe that the circumstances or that those symptoms will lift and that I will feel better at some point. But I really do believe that in a lot of cases, those symptoms and circumstances change. If I go back to what I spoke about in the beginning, when Wayne left Trinity Methodist, it was an adjustment phase for all of us. It was hard to say goodbye, and it felt like, sure, we have to start a whole new spiritual journey. But we found grace, which was amazing. And then in 2012, we got the news that Wayne is coming back to Grace Umhlanga. So it is quite amazing. how that temporary anguish that we went through when Wayne left, it was temporary and it changed. I think the same can be said about most emotions. In relationships with your spouse or the person that you're in a relationship with, you can get incredibly angry with that person. So angry that to the person you love most, you will say the most horrendous things when you're angry. If you leave for work at 7:30 in the morning, and you go through a few meetings, answer a few emails, often at 10 o'clock, that intense anger has dissipated and reduced. And you're almost tempted to send an SMS, unless you're stubborn, to say, I'm sorry and let's not fight. And I think my message in terms of depression is that hang in there. I really do believe that circumstances and symptoms can be temporary. I haven't done any formal research in it, but I think if I had to look at my practice and the people that I see, I would say that 80% of the people that I see, there's a relationship breakdown or tension of some sort coming to the fore, causing enormous stress and conflict, and which can also lead to depression. It might be you just don't get on with your boss. It might be your dad hasn't contacted you for a year. It might be your marriage. It might be your daughter who doesn't speak to you. So I always encourage people who are depressed to work on their relationships. We all want to feel loved and accepted. And when conflict and tension exists in our relationships, and when we feel excluded or judged or rejected, this is often strongly correlated with symptoms of depression. Attending support groups or a home cell or a cell group, in my experience, especially working in the field of addiction, the people, the alcoholics or the people with a history of drug addiction who religiously attend their NA and AA support groups, their recovery prognosis is way higher than people who choose not to. And I think that's for a number of reasons. The first being it provides a forum to express yourself. It provides a forum for people to listen and hear where you're at. It provides a forum for people to pray for you, to send you a message during the week and say, how was that meeting that you had, etc. And, when people are experiencing depression, loneliness, feeling overwhelmed, support is invaluable. The other reason why support groups are so important is because of the whole factor of humility. Recovery requires humility. That's why in AA and NA groups, the first step of the 12-step program is I accept that I'm powerless over this problem and I need the help of God or a higher power to assist me. That is ultimate humility. Change. Recovery is tough. It's not easy. I don't say to anyone that I see, whether it's anorexia, depression, addiction, that this is an easy process. It's not. Staying sober for the rest of your life is incredibly tough. Eating a bowl of macaroni as an anorexic when you've lost 15 kgs and you last ate a bowl of macaroni 5 years ago, it's tough. Getting out of bed when you want to pull the duvet over your head and stay in bed for the rest of the day is tough. And if we listen to the feeling of this bowl of macaroni is going to make me overweight, or I'm too depressed to get out of bed, if we listen to the emotion, we're in trouble. We've got to make a cognitive decision that I'm going to get out of bed, and that's up to you. And I've got to make a behavioral change where I eat that bowl of macaroni. The next point that I want to make is choices. And I want to emphasize this. More and more people that I'm seeing in my practice and in my rooms are as a result of poor choices. We all have the freedom of choice, and it's a wonderful thing, or most of us do. But we need to take into consideration the consequences of our choices. And in families and in relationships, in the modern world, I just feel like people are not taking into consideration the enormous damage that they're going to cause in their own lives, plus the lives of others. So it's important for people to start being aware of the choices that they make. Caring for the carer. I've spoken a lot about people who are having difficulties with depression and who need support, etc. But it's so important for us not to forget the families and the loved ones trying to take care of the people who are suffering from depression. The anxiety that they might go through, wondering whether their child might just commit suicide. And so it's a really important part of one of my recommendations in terms of taking care of that person. I have to include this one, although a lot of people will probably be angry with me. Cannabis. While I realize and acknowledge that medicinal cannabis oil is bringing huge relief to patients with multiple sclerosis, etc., and I acknowledge that there's a place for that. However, the psychiatrists of the South African Society of South Africa, South African Society of Psychiatrists issued a statement last year where they quoted numerous studies saying that under no circumstances do they support the legalization of cannabis. And they quoted studies which were well researched in terms of the harmful effects of cannabis. I've shared rooms with Dr. Kim Domingo, the psychiatrist, since 2001, and I think every year we will have at least 4 or 5 people who've developed a very serious psychosis or schizophrenia as a result of smoking cannabis. So besides that, people forget that they're smoking cannabis. So the increase in lung cancer and the harmful side of that is just one thing. The second thing that people don't realize is that cannabis contains THC. Your cannabis oil is more free of the THC. That's why it's safer. It's more cannabinoid pure. But it's the THC in cannabis, which is fat soluble, which does not flush out of your system. Heroin, cocaine, alcohol, it's all flushed out of your system within 48 hours. But regular daily cannabis use, the THC levels in the body just increase and increase and increase, and results in what we call amotivational syndrome: depression, irritability, loss of motivation, apathy, tiredness, as indicated, amotivational syndrome. So those 18 to 24-year-olds who are dropping out of tech, university, college, mostly because they're just demotivated and tired. Right, I'm done.
Yo, there's lots of you, eh?
So, good evening, everyone. My name's Mark. This is my wife, Christine, and we've been depressed for 25 years. Don't hurt yourself, Jeff. Just by way of introduction, if you don't know us, Christine and I started Grace about 27 years ago, and have a wonderful experience in this church. And part of that journey, about 23, 24 years ago, I woke up one morning, my wife couldn't get out of bed. She was crying. There were some kind of early warning symptoms about this happening, but growing up in the kind of church environment, we didn't believe in mental illness, because the Bible says that God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. And So we thought, if you are feeling down, you just need to pray more, go to church more, and sing more. And everything will come right. And so when Christine literally woke up one morning, couldn't get out of bed, and was crying perpetually and sleeping all the time, I certainly, I think we both went into a sincere fear mode. Fortunately, we had good friends about us, and after 2 or 3 days of this, we eventually, a doctor friend of ours suggested that Christine had clinical depression. And that was really confusing, just purely because of our Christian story, never mind the complexity of depression. And from there, we began a journey, and I'm delighted to say that so many of these symptoms and some of what James has already said, we could relate to so strongly, because Christine did close the door on certain things. She pursued the chemical provisions, the medication. She pursued psychology, but most of all, she pursued mental health, and was incredibly brave. So, Christine, how did you get well?
James is supposed to ask the questions, not you.
Okay, Christine, first question. How would you rate Mark's EQ?
1 to 10.
Christine, maybe you can just talk us through your journey of where you got to that point where you thought, I need to get some help.
I think for me, when I became aware of mental health as a very clear and legitimate issue, and I started looking back at my life, I recognized moments where this thing was threatening, but my self-awareness was so low, and my self-care was so non-existent that I ignored and suppressed any symptoms that were telling me, you're not okay, there's something wrong. I used to think people like that were pathetic. And so I wasn't going to be pathetic. And so the phrase, pull yourself together, was probably something I did once too often. So you started off by saying, how did I realize?
No, how did you get to that point where you thought?
Okay, so for me, it was actually quite simple because it was very dramatic. I pulled myself together a number of times when my body and my soul and my spirit and my everything was telling me, you're not okay, and I ignored it. And so finally, I think one of the things that somebody said to me was, to go as long as you did, you actually had to be very strong, because I was feeling so weak for having fallen off the bus. So it was a Monday morning. Actually, it was that weekend. It was a long weekend, and we had agreed that we wouldn't talk work. And I was pushing for, our church was really small, and Mark was not feeling like a success. So I was trying to fix that in order for him to feel like a success and start being nicer to me as a result. So I was working flat out to get this little thing called Grace Family Church off the ground. And I wanted to start small groups. And I remember I sidled up to the study door where you were probably playing computer games. Remember you had that aeroplane game on the...
No, I was praying.
I remember I had a clipboard in my hand, and I sort of thought, let me just test the waters, Mark. And he looked at me and said, I thought we weren't going to talk work. And it was like And then that Sunday in church, there was a little incident as well, and I felt like this cave-in, and I pulled myself together, got home that night, and there was a movie called Nell with Jodie Foster. She was really young. It was about this girl who was found sort of in the Ozark Mountains somewhere in Arkansas or wherever, and she had been left and grown up on her own. She couldn't speak linguistically. She had somehow survived, and they rescue her, and she's got like this simple, pure beauty in her being for not having been contaminated in any way or affected in any way by. And I watched this movie and the tears just started going down. I just lay there, I never sobbed, I never made a sound. The tears were just pouring down my cheeks. And I thought, I wonder what's going on. And I realized that I saw something in her that I was a million miles away from. Like just pure and whole. And the next morning we went for a walk. We used to take Mondays off then, which is not a good idea if you're in ministry. And we were walking along Umhlanga Promenade, and Mark said, aren't you going to talk today? And I remember saying, I feel like if I start talking, I'll cry. And as I said the word cry, the tears just started pouring down. And I said to him, my legs don't want to work. Can we sit? And we sat, and I put my head on his shoulder, and I just cried. So I didn't have to even have any self-awareness. My body just, it was a dramatic, like, I could not function. I could only weep. I would cry for nothing. I would just want to sleep. So it was self-explanatory. That's how I realized.
Thanks, Christine. And as a mum and as a wife in your family, when you feel that overwhelmed and you feel like I'm not functioning, how did that affect you?
I think that was probably the worst thing, was the idea that I wasn't going to. Nikki was 6, Jess was 12, and Shani was 10. And my little girl was just about to start grade 1. In fact, she had already started grade 1, and it was in the August of her grade 1. And I think that was probably the thing that was the most painful thing, was that role as a mother was being jeopardized, and I wasn't able to be a good mom. So what I did have, I gave to them, not to Mark or to the church. So they had the afternoons, but if they had a fight, I would just start crying. I mean, it was horrible. And I remember a lady came to me one day and said to me, you know, Christine, my father was depressed, and you need to be very, very, very careful with your children. I thought, you old witch. It didn't help, you know. And I asked Jessica once, you know, honey, how did it feel for you? How badly affected were you in my darkest, darkest days? And she gave me the most encouraging answer. She said, Mom, I was 14. I was so preoccupied with myself, I don't think I even noticed. I think you let me off the hook, honey. That was very, very hard not to function, not to be able to function in something that is so important to you.
And Christine, what did you and Mark decide to tell the kids, the older ones, who had been aware of what was going on?
Well, I was terrified because my kids went to a Christian school called Victory Christian Academy. And I was terrified of them thinking I had mental problems. Back then, this is 22 years ago, it was quite a thing. For a pastor's wife to get that depressed. So we knew we had to tell them something. The first 4 days we called it flu. But there was no snot, so I don't know. Actually, there were lots of tears and snot. But I told Nikki, Mummy has an energy sickness. Okay, she was 6. I don't know, what did we tell you? What did we tell the girls? What did you say to them?
I've just suppressed it all, have I? I don't know. I think the girls twigged that Christine generally had sufficient. Once Christine's medication kicked in, once she was in counsel, which was pretty soon into that journey. I mean, how long was it? So there was a 3-month period of confusion, but once the medication came in and Christine was in counseling, Christine really had energy she had energy in the morning when the kids got up, and she had energy when they got home from school and went to bed. But in those periods between is where the personal fight was. So I think what there was at the time. And the girls, we used to talk house mom. And we had a kind of a code language around it and say, well, mom's not well today. And that was enough without going into it. So we didn't live in some sort of denial, but we didn't sit them down and give them a 20-point PowerPoint presentation. But having said that, I think that as my children did incredibly well. And as far as I can detect, and Jess is here, you can talk to her, I don't think they carried resentment that their mother wasn't as engaged, because she was. But I did carry resentment that my wife wasn't as engaged. And that's another whole story. But
Okay. Christine, in 2019, do you think that if you'd had your experience today rather than 22 years ago, that it's changed at all?
It would have been different for me.
Yes.
Definitely.
Okay. How would you describe those differences?
I think people talk about it much more. It's not as stigmatized anymore. There's a lot more information around it. There's a lot more resources available, a lot more support. I know particularly at Grace, our series is called It's Okay to Not Be Okay, and we're trying to tell people you're not alone. But I think at the time, I felt very, very alone. I really thought this should not happen to someone like me. I had a wonderful, godly husband, just amazing man of God. I had 3 beautiful children. We were the pastors of a church. We had like a hotline to God. We were called and anointed and all that stuff. And this shouldn't happen. So I think today there are more voices. It's I don't want to say it's been normalized, but it's been acknowledged. So we came out of complete ignorance into this. So I don't think, yeah. It would have been better now. But I don't want another one now.
if I could just add to that, you made the point. It is a long journey and it's hard. And I think in a society today where we would like a quick fix, we'd like to take a pill. And we have, and I've spoken to lots of people who've gone onto medication. The medication makes you feel better, so you go off the medication. And that's just a cycle. Therapy is incredibly important. Yeah. And there has to be a will to, if it's clinical and a psychiatrist, and I would suggest that as opposed to a GP. A lot of GPs are very informed. Here's my medical advice. All your GPs are going to sue me afterwards. But anyway, but I do think that medication is important if it's with counseling. The two have to go hand in hand.
So Christine, last question. For someone out there who's feeling fragile, emotionally overwhelmed, what would your message to them be?
Well, I would say I know this sounds like, but take yourself seriously. Trust yourself. Trust your body. Trust what you're feeling. Don't tell yourself you're just being stupid. Go for help. Go talk to your GP. Go talk to someone. I think it's easy to ignore and suppress and cancel yourself out as a possible sufferer of depression. Yeah, well, you know what you said tonight that really clicked for me is the reactive depression and the clinical depression. And as you spoke, I realized that I was accurately diagnosed as having a clinical expression. I was dysfunctional for more than 3 weeks. I could not function. For me, it was very clear. I think it's hard when you're wondering, is this just how serious are these feelings? How seriously should I take them? And it's scary. It's humiliating. It's hard to face stuff about yourself that maybe you don't want to face. So I think that I would say to you, don't shortchange yourself. Go talk to someone and go to a professional. Don't be scared of them. They're good people and they can help you figure out what's going on and help you understand And for me, if this can encourage you, as hard as what it was, and as frightening as it was coming out of our Christian context, I would not change a thing, because the stuff that got me there so badly needed to change and never would have changed. The change that happened to me internally through therapy and through journeying this and talking to people, there are things there that would not have changed if I hadn't crashed as badly as I crashed. I would not have faced them. I wouldn't have been desperate enough to face them. And so good can come out of you facing what it is you're going through. Don't be scared of it. It's not the end. It's probably the beginning of a necessary change in your life. So in a way, don't demonize it. Say, no, if this is my reality, it's valid. And God can bring good out of it. I can change for the better. I wanted to ask you.
Just don't charge her.
Oh, someone bring me a couch. You were talking about reactive depression is often temporary. Is that true of clinical depression, or is that a little bit like you pretty much your whole life you're going to have to manage this thing, as do addicts? And
So clinical depression will often end up being a diagnosis of a recurrent depressive disorder. In other words, the person's got a predisposition to depression, and obviously when they're under more stress, they're more susceptible to developing another depressive episode. So with regard to medication, the rough guideline is I go onto medication. When I start feeling better, let's say that's after 6 to 12 months, I must be symptom-free for a year before I decide that I want to come off the medication. And then in terms of the next guideline, if I've had 2 relapses, in other words, I've come off the medication and I've had another depressive episode, then one should rather be on the medication longer term.
see, that's what happened to me. I was off it for a while, and I was relapsing. And I was also going into menopause. So my GP said, listen, given your history, consider HT, hormone therapy, and I mean, the life had gone out of me again. And so I went back onto medication then, more than a decade ago, and I've made a choice to just remain on it. Yeah. I don't really care whether I need it or not. Yeah. Maybe it is helping, maybe it isn't helping, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's
Depressed.
I think it's unique for each person. Yes. So most people, it's natural to, when they are feeling better, to want to consider coming off the medication, because they might feel like, I'd rather see if I can cope without it. Yeah. But then they have to work it out for themselves in terms of, can I come off it and stay off it, or do I need to stay on it more long term? Okay, thanks, Christine. Mark, your turn. It's a generalization, but for men like you, the statement, I need to fix this immediately, how would you comment on that?
I would say about a 10. No, without doubt, as we've explained, our whole cultural background in the Christian world I came in, and the Christian world is a very broad world as to how people express their faith. There's no one way on this deal. And certainly the original place where we came from, mental illness wasn't even a factor. Never mind the cultural realities back in those days. So, and my temperament is to fix stuff, and it was my desire to try to fix Christine. Not just with depression, with a lot of things. I always thought that I'd be a better man if she would only be better as a person. No, forgive me. All right, but yeah, to answer your question, definitely.
And Mark, with your busy workload, your family, and now Christine is really struggling, what were some of the biggest fears that you faced at that point?
I think the initial fear, without doubt, was confusion. Trying to understand what this is, what depression is, and what it's all about, and how do you find some kind of therapy or way forward. And Christine really, she really sought out. There was no Google then, which may have been a good thing, but Christine really sought out mental health. She did everything in her power to find the right counselor that would help her, to get onto the right medication. If we remember, sort of in the 80s, there was like a Prozac revival. Everybody was on that kind of thing. And Christine wasn't getting into the fashionable side of that. She really pursued health, And for me, it really was an inspiration to me, James, for me to try and lend support. She came back from the therapists, and we would debrief a lot of what her counselor was taking her through. And so for me, in that respect, I almost think Christine led the way, in terms of the support. My role, I think, was to provide as much support as I could and to lend into to engage with my children, which wasn't a sacrifice. The work that I've done has given me certain privileges. I've been to more ballet recitals than everybody here combined. But I could do that, So for me, I think Christine helped, Christine's desire for health and there have been relapses, as Christine said, but essentially Christine has lived in a mentally healthy condition for most of her adult life since that. And from that perspective, there's been difficulties, but as you said, I think life's difficult.
Yeah.
Can I just add there? Did I switch it off? No. It put a lot of strain on our marriage. And I remember the day Mark said to me, "You're not the girl I married." And I wasn't. I was a bright, charming, I was a alive lady when he married me. And so it's really hard on the spouse, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So Mark, if you had to have that journey over again, is there anything when you look back that you would do differently?
Ask Christine. I think, as Christine said, I think there's more information available. I think it's still stigmatized to some degree. I was sharing with our church, if I came in on a bandage, people will show me sympathy. What happened to you? So I broke my arm. If I came in with a bandage around my head, they say, "What happened to you?" I said, "No, I'm depressed." They'll duck for cover, you know what I mean? So there is still some form of stigmatization around depression. But I think if it had happened today, the first thing that you spoke about is the whole validation thing. This is your reality. It's no good over-analyzing why I am where I am. Of course, that becomes the shrink's problem. But it really is about the stuff that you're speaking about. I think if people take that stuff seriously and you are journeying with a spouse in depression, you may need some help yourself. You may need to get a support group. You may need to go get a counselor yourself, just to help you be the support, because it's unpredictable to some degree. I mean, I know Christina, and I've never told her this, and I'm still not going to tell her, but she has certain triggers in her mannerisms, and I know that an episode's coming on its way. And we can prepare for that, We can anticipate this is what's going to happen. And in the early stages of her depression, I became incredibly fearful, because Christine did talk suicide conversations. Not killing herself, but she said, "I'd rather be dead than this." Yeah. Which is incredibly scary. But after a while, the fear element of an episode, that's quite a hectic word in itself. But you start having more confidence in her ability to cope and to anticipate and to acknowledge. Listen, Christine, you've been, the personal care stuff is being neglected. Take some time out. Christine, through this journey, has really discovered a very powerful form of faith in God through a contemplative form of loving God. And I know that when she's in that space, she'll be healthy. So I suppose for me, it is a more affirming of what's going on without the need to fix her or the need to or become fearful, because that really was, in those early days, it was very real.
Yeah. And Mark, being the head of a church where your main mission is to serve people, look after their needs, find out how they're doing, how did you manage the fact that you there, and on some days you feel like, how on earth am I going to give to all these people when I feel like I can hardly manage myself?
Jesus is the head of the church, but I'm his right-hand man. No, I think to some degree, I think both of us were fairly transparent around this journey. We weren't trying to pretend that we have this perfect life. People impose that on you, and I just fooled them. No, I think it's from a position of understanding. There are limitations to all of us, and I've never really tried to pretend I'm somebody I'm not, and to attempt to live transparently without bleeding over people. And people were around us. We had a great team, and we have a great team, and they've been very accommodating and very supportive. And couldn't do it without that, It's a team of people that have your back, as it were.
Yeah. Mark and Christine, I think on behalf of everyone here, it's we're incredibly blessed and privileged to have you guys sharing such personal, private journeys. And thank you very much for your very inspirational message.
So we're going to have a time of Q&A now, and if you would like to ask any of our amazing speakers tonight a question, you can. Jeff and Lou are going to have microphones with them, and then I'll just help field our questions and manage our time. So if you have a question, won't you raise your hand, and we'll try and get to as many people as we can in the next sort of half an hour or so. And you can just keep your hand up if you really want your question answered. And we'll see how many people we can get to. So let's kick us off. Who's going to be the person to ask the first question? Here we go, right in the front, easy.
So I have some friends that swear that taking shrooms is a good thing. And like people who are dying from cancer and stuff, they take shrooms and they all of a sudden can face death and not be afraid of it, and it eliminates fear, and that they have this connection with the higher power and God, and it's like a very godly experience. What are your thoughts on shrooms?
What's a shroom?
Magic mushrooms.
He's telling me.
For me, having worked in addiction for over 20 years, any substance that's mind or mood altering, there's a risk involved. So it's like anything. If you Google the benefits of cannabis, you're going to come up with a whole lot of research of genuine cases where people have experienced benefits of some nature, pain relief, same with magic mushrooms. But if you Google the dangers of magic mushrooms, cannabis, etc., you're going to come up with a whole lot of research as well, which kind of points out the dangers and the risks involved. So for me, with something like magic mushrooms, where it's not as physically addictive as something like cocaine, one can't forget the psychological dependence. And I think the moment we begin to medicate any form of emotion or symptom, we're developing a dependence. Someone who uses alcohol socially, glass of wine with your spouse at the end of the day and a catch-up, that's social, it's reasonable. When people start drinking, 8 drinks in a night, that's no longer social. There's a dependence, there's an excess forming there. So from my perspective, I'll always be skeptical of that, having worked in this field.
And another one, I've got a friend who's got MS, and I suggested cannabis oil to him, and now I'm feeling like maybe I shouldn't have, but it has stopped his shakes and stuff like that. So in that circumstance, what are your thoughts?
You know, chronic pain is psychologically, it's very debilitating. So whether you've got terminal cancer and you're in enormous pain, someone might use cannabis oil, someone might use morphine, is one better than the other? I think for some of your chronic medical conditions, like multiple sclerosis, cancer, etc., if someone's going to get some sort of benefit from that, then yeah, I think there's a place for it. Did I answer your question?
Can you stick your hand up if you have a question? Here we go. Here's a question in the front, Jeff. You run. And then over here after that.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'm sure many of us have possibly read in the paper or saw on the TV that young people and even older people have just taken their lives. And surely that just couldn't happen overnight. So there were things that were happening along the way, and we're just wondering about their respective families or friends who probably didn't notice or did notice and did nothing about it. So the question is that when you see signs of something like this going on, how do you get to telling these people to sort of solve the problem, as it were?
Mark, Christine, do you guys want to answer? The first thing that I would say is, I've had to learn the hard lesson in my work that I'm not God and I can't be responsible for everything. I'm not going to cure every depression. I'm not going to prevent every suicide. So the first way I would answer that question is I would say, we do need to try and pick up on signs and symptoms. And in young people, it's often going to be expressed through their behavior. They're not necessarily going to come and open up their hearts to you and say, I've been feeling incredibly depressed for the last while. So it is important to act on symptoms and to ask people how they're feeling, because children who are feeling like that are going to fear that I'm going to be a failure or a disappointment to mum or dad or the family, and that's going to embarrass them, etc., etc. But on the other hand, someone who successfully commits suicide, they're probably going to succeed in what they plan and carry out. That's the sad reality. People who end up committing suicide, I often believe that in a lot of those cases, no one would have prevented it. They were very intentional.
James, I wanted to find out, in the counseling room, do you have any throwaway tips for making a patient feel validated, to actually feel that when they come out with what they're struggling with?
Tips for how to make them feel validated. Yeah. Okay, let me use a marriage counseling example. It might sound bizarre to try and illustrate this. But if I'm counseling a couple and the wife says to the husband, for the last while, I've just felt that you've been distant. Now, if the husband responds by explaining that she shouldn't be feeling that way because of X, Y, and Z, they're going to get into a big debate as to whether she should be feeling distant or not. And that's pointless. I become the referee, and someone's going to think I've taken sides, and one person's going to drop out of counseling. So what I would say to the husband is, if you responded to your wife and said, okay, Jessica, can you give me an example of what I do that makes you feel like I'm distant? It's a completely different response. There's an acknowledgement that, okay, maybe I do something that makes my wife feel distant. And I'm going to accept that she's telling me this because it's real, not because she wants to judge me or criticize me. And the reality is that if Bruce walks out of that counseling session and says, I'm going to do that differently, Jessica feels like he's no longer distant. She feels like he's made an effort. He's heard me. He's got it. He's validated me. And she's probably going to reciprocate and make an effort to reach his needs in terms of what he's struggling with. And you get the win-win situation. Versus the debate, he doesn't get it. He doesn't believe me. He doesn't agree. He's right. Stuff him. I'm not going to do that for him. And that's the tit-for-tat downward spiral. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
So you're saying the same would apply for depression, where you acknowledge their feelings? Is what you're
Yes.
saying?
So as a therapist or a counselor, you want to give the person the message that you believe that what they're telling you is real, and you, on top of that, try and understand it more specifically. I feel depressed. Okay, Bruce, tell me a little bit about that. Depression is a broad term. In your life specifically, what's happening that's making you feel depressed? The person immediately feels like he's interested. He believes that I'm depressed. He's not disputing that, and he wants to find out more.
Hello, everyone. Hi. So, very interesting thing. I got hold of a set of books and literature a couple of months ago about addiction, and specifically a concept called the ludic loop.
The what?
The ludic loop. And the ludic loop is an exploitation that's being used in social media and games and everything at the moment that triggers the dopamine hit. And what happens is every time you go into social media, anytime you go onto Facebook or LinkedIn, anytime you get kind of any social validation back, it triggers a dopamine hit. The first time is quite a lot, but it degrades slowly, and eventually you go through this numbness of, you do something, and if you find a piece of information that's good or amusing, you get a small dopamine hit. Now, the ludic loop is, the book is actually called Addiction by Design, and it's actually how to design addictive products. And it's quite interesting as well, because the contrast of it is there's another book by an endocrinologist who says, and I might be terribly misquoting, but that the more dopamine hits that we get, the more it actually degrades the quality of serotonin in our body. I don't know if that's true as well. But the link to it is we live in a world as well where everything that is competing for our attention and everything is making us feel inferior. Like even the whole Facebook Cambridge Analytics scandal, it wasn't that they had the information about us. It was that they had the information about our personality profiles. So things like Facebook could purposely make you sad or happy or depressed in order to promote different kinds of adverts. They knew if they showed you a whole bunch of sad feeds and then an advert about going on holiday, you were more likely to click on that holiday advert. Now, the interesting thing is people understand this and have been exposed to it, but they still accept it. Which is just a demonstration of how that ludic loop actually plays in modern day psychology. And the more we expose to this, the more we actually rely on these dopamine hits, where we are actually silently becoming addicted to all of these things without even realizing it. We all know it's a problem. We're all like, I can stop any time. But when you try, you're like, well, why can't I stop this? What's wrong? What's going on? And it's interesting because, addiction, we always think, it's the people who drink too much, or it's the people who are using substances. But it's not, hey, I can't stop watching this series, or I've taken a photo.
Sorry to interrupt you, because I think you're on a fascinating stream, but do you have a question for James?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Anyone wants some really great research on social media and addiction, you can come and find you afterwards. Okay, but what would you like to ask James tonight?
The question is that true? is the constant hit of dopamine that we all get. Like, I mean, I'm pretty sure almost everybody's on Facebook. Is that dopamine, is that dopamine hit, does it affect long-term serotonin levels?
I'm not so sure about the part about serotonin levels, but your neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline, are all responsible for mood changes. So whether we're gambling, which doesn't involve an addictive substance that we're consuming, or whether it's a substance that we're inhaling, smoking, snorting, etc., there's a mood change as a result of what is changed in the brain from a neurotransmitter basis. So yes, whether it's gambling or gaming, there's a shift in the neurotransmitters that causes the mood change, and that can be a pleasant response, especially with dopamine. That's why, cocaine targets the dopamine receptors, so that's why people get that incredible high. So your stimulants are more associated with the dopamine, whereas your people who are anxious, they turn more to the central nervous system depressants, cannabis, alcohol, tranquilizers, because it lowers it relaxes them. So I think anything that's creating a mood change has the potential to create harm.
Thanks, James. There was someone in the middle who had that. Oh, you've got your mic. Brilliant.
Thank you. So I've been diagnosed with bipolar depression clinically, been on meds and trial and error. Acknowledgement to you for opening up about the trials of depression. I think bipolar depression is something that is a little extreme for most people to understand, because it's literally fighting with yourself in your mind every day. But so I'm leading to the question, just a small lead up to that is, with regards to suicide and relationships and all these things, it's very difficult to talk. Not because we don't want to, but because you don't know what to say. And unfortunately, the relationships you lose and the mental and emotional trials of this process, sometimes, unfortunately, because you couldn't find the words, you lose people, you lose relationships, you lose friendships, you even lose... my husband and I had to go through a very difficult period because of that. So my question really is, how, if you're so stuck in your mind and you're fighting this battle every day, how do you communicate better to people who are trying to help you? Because the question to them is simple: how do I help you? I don't know. I don't know, but I want you to. How do I better communicate that without losing them or being the burden, displacing the burden onto them? Thank you.
Okay, so I think there's stages in any recovery process, and I think when someone is acutely symptomatic, they are particularly unstable, and if they turn to friends and loved ones around them, those friends and loved ones may feel overwhelmed and not equipped to deal with it and might move away, which sounds like a little bit of what you're experiencing or have experienced recently. So my advice in a situation like that would be to take the stage of your condition from an acute to a more stable position, where the thoughts are not racing as much, you feel a little less fragile. And I think a professional, whether it's counseling plus a psychiatrist who's going to assess that carefully and who's going to help stabilize your mental state, will get you to a point where you feel a little stronger and more stable. And then I think at that point, reaching out to the people around you might be easier, and they might feel a little less intimidated by it.
I'd like to also just respond to that. I remember moments where I'd say to Mark, you can't help me. You're not equipped. I need professional help. And I think you have to right-size what your friends and your family are able to do for you when you're in the what I used to call a nameless despair. It was just dark. And I also think that it's all very, like, go for professional help. I think it can be hard to find the right therapist for you because it's someone you should be able to journey with. So that there were things that I spoke about. I was fortunate that the medical aid that I was on back then, you guys didn't charge so much 22 years ago. I could go for about 9 months. And it was the year of deep change for me. And we were talking stuff I couldn't take home. So I think when we say go for professional help, I tried a therapist, I saw him twice, they did nothing for me. No, you haven't. You need to journey with someone, and if you can't afford it, find someone who's equipped to help you with what you're busy with. So that what you share with your family and your friends is palatable and, you know what I'm saying.
Okay, so lady there.
When dealing with children, is there an appropriate age that they would go onto medication, or is there rather an inappropriate age, a specific age where they shouldn't be on medication?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Sadly, I think that question 20 years ago would have been answered very differently. I think 20 years ago it would have been a case of absolutely no, whereas the reality is that if you go to any primary school now, that's grade 4 to 7, on a Monday morning, you're probably sitting with 2 or 3 people or kids who can't get into school because they're so anxious or overwhelmed by the pressures. That's sadly the reality that we're dealing with. So I'm very conservative when it comes to medication, so others might answer this question differently. My general guideline is to try and delay that as much as possible and to rather go the counselling support group route. I think a lot of the primary schools and high schools in the area now are employing full-time counsellors for this exact reason. However, I certainly do work with some adolescents where I've suggested that we do a trial of medication to help them with the symptoms that they're experiencing. And you also need to have a very good look at the history. If you've got someone who's got a fairly clear history in terms of no real history of mental health difficulties in the family, that's a guide to rather try and go the counselling route. If you've got a history of someone where there's a significant number of people who've had difficulties, you're probably going to need to consider the medication option.
Hi, everyone. 2 questions. The first one is, what then happens in a situation where the support structure is not really supportive, either one, because the support structure doesn't really believe in depression or mental illness or whatnot, or number 2, the support structure has got their own issues, their own depression that they need to deal with that they don't know about. Second question, if it's something that's so important to deal with, why is the practice not really affordable to most people?
Sorry, just repeat the second question.
The second question, if it's something that is so important to deal with, then why is it something that's not so easily available to most people?
Okay.
Financially, mostly.
Okay, so the first question, every psychologist works differently. I would probably say that I don't really like working with people in isolation, so I like to include someone else from the family. So if I was working with someone and they just said, my family have different cultural beliefs, spiritual beliefs about depression, they don't really think that it's an issue, or my family is so conflicted that they're not going to be of much support, I would recommend, with the person's buy-in, that we have a family session and that we discuss that as a family to see if one could create some change there. If that doesn't work, then the therapist is going to have to work with the person, help them accept that they're going to need to try and look for other forms of support. I wish I could find the answers to your second question. It's a question I'd love to pose to senior leadership in this country, because if you go and Google the increase in mental health difficulties, I think they're starting to regard stress, anxiety, depression as the conditions that are going to cost health exorbitant amounts in the next 20 years. It's just exponential. Every year, Dr. Domingo and I just say, it's getting worse and worse every single year. So the need is enormous. But, and with NHI, the National Health Insurance, they're talking highly about, that being available to everyone. And if they eventually got to that point and they employed a whole lot of psychologists in the public sector, then it would be more accessible to people. But I think the NHI is going to focus a lot on primary health care, and psychology is unfortunately not regarded as sort of primary health care. So unfortunately, I think we're quite a long way off that.
If I can just answer the first question a little bit too, that I think that, and for context, obviously I, as a teenager, witnessed my parents navigating this and experienced it as a bystander, but also have journeyed with depression. Thanks for the genes, Mum. But I also think that so much of what James has indicated and we've heard tonight is about choice. And that sometimes the idea that we don't have a supportive environment and our spouse doesn't understand, or our friends don't get it, or we're in a community that it can be a little bit of an excuse sometimes. And I've been there where I just want people to help me. And so much of the journey to recovery is ownership, is taking responsibility, is just doing the next right thing. Sometimes the next right thing is close the door to suicide ideation. Sometimes it's get out of bed, but sometimes it's go to a church that supports mental health, or go to that support group at the library, even though you don't know anyone, or whatever your little bit of capacity gives you to take ownership, because that will get you to a healing place quicker than if you're waiting for a great support network, or your family to come on board, or your friends to understand the language that you're speaking. So again, I speak very, I don't know, I'm not a professional in this, but I do know that I've made the mistake of sitting around and waiting for people to say, are you okay? What can we do to help? What do you need? And actually, I needed to make a difficult but helpful decision to do something that I wasn't getting from the people around me. So self-care is really, really, really important. It's not just like, Mom's having a glass of wine and a bubble bath. That's not self-care. That it needs to be like, I'm going to do something that no one else is offering me right now. I'm going to go and look for someone who will help me and be proactive. Okay, so let's take maybe 2 more questions. Yes.
You want to?
Okay, we're going to do this question in the front, and then there's someone at the back waving there on the end. Gotcha. Okay, and we'll do a couple at the back.
Thinking maybe I'll go now. I just wanted to give a little bit of hope more so than anything. My name's Jade. My name's 27. I'm 27, turned 27 this year. I was diagnosed with depression at 16 and was put on medication, was on medication for 7 years. Looking back now, after finding God, I haven't touched anything for 3. So I feel like it's the hardest thing, but it's the easiest thing. You being depressed is because you're surrounded by all the wrong things, the wrong people. It's your avatar, it's your soul telling you something's not right. So as soon as you self-care, as soon as you look at yourself in the mirror, and exactly that, self-care, and being, instead of, well, poor me, why is this happening to me? At the end of the day, who am I anyway? nobody, but that makes me everything. But through God, that's what I realized, you know? And we can say, well, put her on medication or, just stop being a victim, because we're all victims. But are you going to be a victim for the rest of your life, or are you going to take the wheel? Because no one's coming to save you.
You know, Jade, just
Sorry,
off the...
okay, yeah.
No, but thanks. What I would like to say off the back of what Jade is saying is that there's so many different stories, and thank you for sharing some of your journey with us. And at the root of self-care is emotional and mental health, and we're going to let you know a little bit about this just now. But the wholeness course is something that Grace Family Church runs that is exactly that you take responsibility and you look at your mindsets, you look at your life circumstances. I would say it's at the base level. Mads, who heads up our counseling ministry, has got a beautiful pyramid that starts with self-care, moves to community care, then moves to kind of your professional care. And a lot of our conversation tonight has been about some of those top tiers, and then probably some people in this room who need that top tier level of care. But there are others who at that bottom level of care who are maybe doing something just to be healthy and get ahead of the game would be to do something like our wholeness course, where you do look at your mindsets and are you a victim, and are you looking at the role of spirituality and God and Jesus in your life. So that is definitely part of the conversation for some people who are kind of working on that lower tier of health and mental health. Okay, right at the back there, have you got the mic? Yes, you do.
Hi. I wonder if you can give us some advice. How do you go about finding the right psychiatrist? Okay, I've had a son that's been on medication and severely depressed for 2 years. We've gone through various psychiatrists, and there seems to be an alter ego that they've got to change everything that's been done before, and within a 5 to 10 minute consultation, they're happy to double, triple dosages. How do you, as a parent, what is your advice on this topic?
Ooh, that could get me into a lot of trouble. I actually struggle myself in terms of who I feel comfortable referring to in terms of psychiatrists. And therapists all have their own preferences in terms of who they refer to and who they use. The sad reality in South Africa is that we've probably got about 250 psychiatrists. So none of them have any time. By the time they're doing follow-ups, they are doing 15-minute consultations with someone asking, how did you, this is not all, but a lot, how did you sleep, any side effects from the medication, very simple, basic questions, and that's what they have time for. And, not all psychiatrists, I firmly believe that Dr. Domingo is someone who I refer to regularly and who, operates from a different perspective. But unfortunately, because they're so busy and because they have such long waiting lists, the reality is that, it's not just because they don't care, it's really because they're trying to get through caseloads that are just exorbitant. So it's not easy to find a psychiatrist that's going to gel, and Dr. Domingo doesn't even take on new patients at the moment. I don't think she's taken on a new patient in her practice for a year now, and she's still fully booked. So it really is a dilemma, and I don't really have an answer to that question, but I guess you've just got to go through the process of trying to find someone who feels like a better fit for your child. But unfortunately, that can take time and it costs money. But it's a problem.
We just want to acknowledge that there's so many complexities around this and so many unique stories in the room tonight. We'd love to take more questions, but we're not going to, because we do have important information that we want to share with you before people start leaving. So before we kind of get into the what next, can we just say thank you to James and to Mark and Christine for their wisdom, their advice. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm sure you feel a little bit like what else is there? And we didn't want to let you walk away tonight without some really practical next steps. So for those of you who are looking for an anxiety and depression support group, we have one that is run by an amazing man called Brendan. Brendan, I know that you would rather stay behind the scenes, but won't you please just stand up so everyone can see Brendan? Let's just thank him for what he does in our community. Brendan was sharing some of the dynamics of how sometimes there are 3 people and sometimes there are 30 people. But if you need support, please connect with Brendan. If you don't talk to him tonight, you can go to our gracecounseling.org.za, gracecounseling.org.za, where there are literally dozens and dozens of resources available to you. We also have face-to-face counseling available through our counseling center. There's one in Riverside in Mgeni Park. There's another one in Belito for those of you who have traveled from the North Coast. And then this is for those of you who are wanting to provide care, be part of the solution. Like Pumi was saying, why is there not more help for people with their mental health? I think we can do something about that. We don't have to wait for our government to get its act together. We can be part of the solution, and one of the ways to do that is to do the wholeness course. You can do it for yourself, or you can do it as a start of a journey towards becoming a lay counselor yourself. But as you can see, it starts tomorrow night. So tomorrow night, right back here at Grace, the wholeness course is starting. We would love for you to register before tomorrow night so that our team, led by Lou Harmon, can make sure that all our ducks are in a row in terms of workbooks and space, and we are ready for you. So you can register. Can you go back to that slide? You can register on the counseling. There it is. So take a photo of this right now if this is something you want to do. And then there's also counseling intensive training for people. If you are a small group leader and you're just feeling like you're a little out of your league with the conversations that you're happening and you're helping people navigate maybe more of the reactive stuff than the clinical stuff, then you can be trained in what we're calling coffee cup counseling. So please reach out to our group life pastors, to our counseling department to find out how you can receive training with coffee cup counseling. But we know we can't solve this overnight, but we really believe if you look around this room, there are enough people to stick up their hands and say, it's okay to not be okay, and we can be part of the solution. Like James said, let's have a solution-based mentality. Before we go, I would love to pray for you and for all of us, and then we will close our evening. God, we recognize our own limitations for healthy, abundant life. And Jesus, we acknowledge that you offer abundant life to us. We pray tonight for those who are experiencing that nameless despair. We pray for your presence and your light to shine in this time of darkness. We pray for those who feel alone, that your love and your peace and your comfort would break through. God, tonight we pray for the incredible people who provide support, for the lay counselors, for the psychologists, for the play therapists, for the psychiatrists, for those who day after day share the burden of mental health. We thank you for them. We are so grateful for their sacrifice and their hard work. And God, we pray that you would continue to pour yourself into them and energize them and equip them for their work. We pray for the family members who are watching the people that they love struggle and despair. And Lord, we ask that they too would find you drawing near to them. And God, as a community, we ask you to continue to challenge us, to reach out, to speak out, and to support one another and to bear each other's burdens. We know that we were not created to walk alone, but with you and with each other towards this abundant life that you have created for us. And so tonight we pray for peace, for your presence, and for your healing in every single person here tonight. In the name of Jesus, amen. Thank you for coming. Please make sure you reach out for the resources that you need. And we hope we see many of you here tomorrow night.